What if I told you that one of the most important ancient women ever found was not a delicate figure from the familiar story of human origins, not a graceful wanderer from a warm savanna, not a slender symbol of early modernity, but a thick-boned, heavy-framed, cold country survivor from northern China, whose body looked as if it had been built for battle. She lived around 260,000 years ago, in a world of hard winters, open woodland, cave shelters, dangerous animals, and shifting glacial climates. And when her bones were first studied, their size seemed so extraordinary that she was taken for a male. That mistake itself tells the story. The skeleton from Jinniushan was not merely large by ancient standards. She was massive in a way that unsettles the neat mental picture many people carry of early humans. She stood roughly 5 feet 5 inches tall, but packed into that frame was a body mass near 170 pounds, a dense, compact, muscular build that would have made her look more like a Pleistocene powerlifter than a fragile ancestor. She was young, probably still in early adulthood, yet her skeleton carried the proportions of a creature shaped by cold, stress, terrain, and survival, with a trunk that was broad, limbs that were comparatively short, and bones that belonged to a population where the body itself was technology. The first shock is not that she existed. The shock is where she existed and when. Jinniushan sits in Liaoning, in northeastern China, not far from the Yellow Sea, within a greater northern world that connected China, Manchuria, Mongolia, the Altai, and Siberia through alternating corridors of grassland, forest, steppe, and frozen ecological barriers. Around 260,000 years ago, this was not the empty far edge of human evolution. It was a major theatre of human adaptation, a place where archaic humans endured conditions that demanded strength, insulation, mobility, and intelligence. The site produced more than a skull with a surprisingly gracile face. It produced vertebrae, ribs, a pelvic bone, limb and hand bones, and foot bones, enough of one individual to see not merely a face or a brain case, but a whole body plan. That is why Jinniushan matters. Most ancient fossils are fragments that tempt imagination. Jinniushan gives us anatomy. She gives us mass. She gives us a pelvis, a trunk, limbs, joints, and the physical reality of an archaic woman who was not a side character in human evolution, but a living experiment in northern survival. Jinniushan sits hundreds of miles south of Harbin and far east of Beijing inside a northern Chinese corridor that could have connected different archaic populations across glacial cycles. Without DNA from Jinniushan, calling her Denisovan as fact goes beyond the evidence, but placing her inside the same broad conversation is completely legitimate. She belongs to the same mystery, large-brained, robust, Eastern Eurasian humans with archaic features and possible ties to the deeper population structure that later appears in Denisovan genetics. This is where the question of her appearance becomes both dangerous and fascinating. Did Jinniushan woman have blue eyes and red hair like the Tarim mummies? The honest answer is that her bones cannot tell us. There is currently zero recovered DNA from Jinniushan that gives eye color, hair color, or skin pigmentation. A skull and pelvis cannot reveal the color of the iris. A femur cannot tell the shade of hair. Jinniushan woman was not proven to have light eyes or red hair, but the theory cannot be dismissed merely because she lived in China. That modern geographic reflex is misleading. The China of 260,000 years ago was not the China of recent history, and Pleistocene populations were not mapped onto modern ethnic categories. Northern China, the Altai, Siberia, Mongolia, and Central Asia were shifting arenas of archaic human adaptation. Populations moved, split, vanished, and merged. Denisovan-related groups occupied extreme environments. Neanderthal-related groups reached far to the east. Jinniushan sits in that larger pattern, a northern archaic woman from a world where the categories had not yet hardened. Her estimated brain size, around 1,330 cubic centimeters, places her within the range normally associated with large-brained humans, yet that number only becomes meaningful when placed against the rest of her body. She was not a small-bodied person with an inflated brain figure. She was a large-bodied archaic human whose encephalization still stands out. Her brain was big, her body was bigger, and together they point to a lineage that had already crossed a threshold of complexity long before the classic late Ice Age world of cave paintings, tailored clothing, and formal symbolic cultures. In older narratives, large brains are treated as if they belong almost exclusively to the final chapter of human evolution, but Jinniushan disrupts that comfort. She was living in the Middle Pleistocene, deep before the period when textbooks usually allow ancient people to feel familiar, yet her cranial capacity was already substantial, and her body was tuned for an environment where survival depended on both strength and cognition. A brain that large inside a body that robust is not a primitive accident. It is a signal of a population facing intense ecological demands and answering them with both physiology and behavior. The body is the part that refuses to be ignored. At roughly 78 kilos, 170 pounds, on a 165 centimetre, 5.4 foot frame, Jinniushan woman was not simply tall or heavy, she was compactly enormous. A modern person of that height and mass varies greatly depending on fat, muscle, bone and activity, but in her case, the skeletal interpretation points toward a wide, thick, powerful frame rather than a soft body. She belonged to the old Pleistocene pattern in which cold-adapted humans tended toward broader bodies and shorter limbs, reducing surface area relative to mass, conserving heat, and turning the torso into a furnace. This is the logic behind Bergman's and Allen's rules, biological principles that explain why animals in cold climates often become heavier and more compact, while populations in warmer climates trend longer and leaner. Jinniushan fits that cold-adapted pattern with almost brutal clarity. She was not built like an equatorial runner, she was built like a northern survivor, the sort of body that could absorb cold, carry stress through the hips and spine, and move through a landscape where winter was not scenery, but pressure. That is why the phrase tank-like is not an exaggeration in a casual sense. It captures the structural idea. Jinniushan woman was a low centre of gravity, heavy frame, broad trunk human, a person whose body plan suggests power rather than speed, endurance through mass rather than grace through length. Imagine a young woman with thick joints, heavy muscle attachments, a deep torso, strong hands, sturdy feet, and a skeleton that forced researchers to reconsider sex because their expectation of female anatomy could not easily contain her size. This is one of the buried lessons of the fossil. Archaic females were not simply smaller versions of modern women. In some Pleistocene populations, females carried a robustness that modern observers misread because we are accustomed to recent gracilized bodies shaped by farming, softer diets, shoes, shelter, textiles, medicine, and thousands of generations of cultural buffering. Jinniushan lived before that cushioning. Her skeleton speaks from an older contract between body and world. The comparison with Neanderthals is unavoidable, because Neanderthals also carried the signature of cold adaptation. Broad bodies, short distal limb segments, powerful trunks, strong hands, and skeletons that look overbuilt by recent standards. Yet Jinniushan belongs to East Asia, not Western Eurasia, and that is where the story becomes more intriguing. Northern China, in the Middle Pleistocene, was part of a world where different archaic lineages overlapped in traits, drifted apart across climate barriers, and repeatedly came back into contact. The old labels struggle here. Some Chinese fossils show mixtures of traits once divided too cleanly between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. What exactly was happening in Eastern Eurasia before the clear arrival of later Homo sapiens? These fossils are not identical, but they share a pattern of mosaic anatomy, with ancient features sitting beside larger brains, flatter faces, thinner cranial vaults, and traits that point neither to simple replacement nor to one straight line. The environment around her was not a gentle homeland. The Jinniushan cave system formed in limestone, and the fossil was found with animals that place her in a living ecosystem, not an abstract evolutionary chart. Brown bears, wolves, deer, rhinoceroses, and other large mammals inhabited the region, along with smaller animals and birds. This was a landscape of mixed habitats, with open areas, wooded patches, wetlands, and seasonal pressures. The Yellow Sea coastline was not identical to the modern coast because sea levels shifted with glacial cycles, opening and covering coastal plains through time. North China during this period sat under the influence of East Asian monsoon systems, cold continental air, and glacial oscillations that repeatedly transformed vegetation. Warm intervals expanded forests and created richer corridors. Cold intervals opened steppe-like zones, stressed water systems, and forced animals into new ranges. To survive here, a human group needed fire, shelter, coordination, and a body capable of enduring hardship when technology fell short. Traces of fire and stone tools at Jinniushan are crucial because they place this woman inside a behavioral world. She was not merely a biological adaptation walking through winter. She belonged to a group that made stone implements, processed animal bodies, gathered plant foods, and controlled fire. Fire changes everything in cold country. It warms the cave, hardens wooden points, scares predators, cooks meat, softens roots, extends the evening, and turns a shelter into a social center. But fire alone did not erase cold. Before tailored clothing became advanced, before complex needle traditions and dense exchange networks, the body still carried much of the burden. That is why her mass matters. Her physique represents a stage of human adaptation where culture and anatomy worked together, but anatomy was still doing heavy labor. She was not simply dressed against the cold, she was built against it. This explains why her size fits a broader middle Pleistocene trend. Human body size appears to have reached some of its most extreme expressions during this era, when archaic populations across Eurasia occupied harsh climates with relatively simple toolkits compared with later Upper Paleolithic cultures. In that context, the Jinniushan skeleton is not an anomaly. It is a peak expression of a broader pattern. But the female sex of the fossil gives the story extra force. Male robustness in archaic humans is expected. Female robustness on this scale forces a different understanding of the whole population. If the women were built this powerfully, the population itself was not merely a group of large males and slight females, it was a robust people. Their average anatomy was shifted towards mass, strength, and cold endurance. Jinniushan woman turns an abstract evolutionary trend into a person. Her age adds a further layer of drama. If she was a young adult, then her skeleton captures a life interrupted early, not a long lifetime of accumulated wear. Some teeth show heavy wear, while others suggest youth, a combination that points toward the abrasive diets and demanding life history of Pleistocene people. Teeth in such groups wore quickly because food carried grit, roots required force, meat processing was tough, and the mouth often served as a third hand. Yet her body had already reached imposing size. She was not a frail elder whose skeleton had thickened with decades of strain. She was a young woman who had grown into a heavy Pleistocene frame as part of her basic biology. That matters because it makes her less an exception produced by personal history and more a representative of a powerful population. The tragedy of Jinniushan is that the cranium was reportedly damaged during excavation and later reconstruction, leaving researchers with a fossil both precious and compromised. This is common in paleoanthropology. The most important specimens often arrive broken, distorted, repaired, debated, and reinterpreted. Yet even with those limits, the postcranial material gives Jinniushan unusual strength as evidence. Many famous fossils are heads without bodies. Jinniushan is a body with a head, a rare chance to connect face, brain, pelvis, trunk, limbs, and mass. That is why her story should not be buried beneath technical caution. She's one of the few Middle Pleistocene individuals who allows us to imagine an entire organism rather than a skull floating in a museum case. She was a living, breathing young woman in a dangerous northern world, and her body was a direct answer to that world. The foramen magnum, the opening at the base of the skull where the spinal cord passes through, has also drawn comparison in discussions of Jinniushan, Harbin, Dali, and Neanderthals. In Jinniushan, it has been described as oval rather than the more rounded condition associated with recent Homo sapiens. Such details are small in isolation, but they accumulate. Cranial vault form, brow thickness, facial breadth, pelvic shape, limb proportions, and brain size together suggest that she belonged to neither a primitive leftover nor a simple modern human ancestor in the narrow sense. She belonged to a structured archaic human world that was producing large brains and powerful bodies in several regions at once. That world included Neanderthals in western Eurasia, Denisovans somewhere across eastern Eurasia, and multiple Asian fossils that refused to line up in a simple row. To understand her world, we have to pull back from the cave and look towards the north. The Altai Mountains were one of the great crossroads of archaic humanity, with Denisovans and Neanderthals both appearing there at different times and even interbreeding there. Northern China was not isolated from that world in a simple way. Across glacial cycles, corridors opened through Mongolia, Manchuria, the Amur region, and Central Asia. Forests expanded during warmer phases. Steppe and cold grassland expanded during colder phases. Populations tracked animals, retreated into refugia, and reappeared when conditions improved. The map breathed. Jinniushan woman lived during one of these deep climatic rhythms long before the final ice age, yet the rules were already in place. Ice did not need to cover Liaoning for cold adaptation to matter. Continental winters, seasonal scarcity, and shifting habitats were enough to favor compact bodies and strong social groups. Her people hunted large animals, gathered plant foods, processed carcasses with stone tools, and returned to cave shelters where fire created a center of warmth. The presence of rhinoceros, deer, bear, and wolf tells us that Jinniushan was not a quiet refuge. It was a contested landscape. Large herbivores offered meat, fat, hides, bone, and sinew, but they also required strategy. Predators competed for carcasses and threatened camps. Winters punished mistakes. In such a world, a tank-like body carried obvious advantages. More mass meant heat retention. Stronger limbs meant carrying power. A broader pelvis and trunk meant a different center of gravity and greater internal volume. Heavy hands and feet meant grip, traction, and force. Her body was not decorative anatomy, it was survival machinery. There is also a social implication. A woman of this size in a small Pleistocene group changes how we imagine labor, danger, and status. She was not merely gathering soft foods at the edge of camp while males confronted the dangerous world. Her skeleton suggests that females in this population carried heavy physical demands. They travelled, climbed, hauled, processed, endured cold, and participated in the full ecological economy of the group. The old division between male hunters and passive females collapses when the female body itself looks engineered for hardship. Jinniushan woman makes it clear that survival in the Middle Pleistocene was not a story of male strength alone. It was a population-wide adaptation. Everyone who survived had to be tough. Her face belonged to an archaic morphology with broadness and depth. The broad face is important because it appears repeatedly in Chinese Middle Pleistocene fossils and later becomes part of the argument over regional continuity. Some researchers have seen in these fossils a deep Asian pattern, with traits linking older and later populations. Others see mosaic evolution, convergent adaptation, or separate lineages mixing over time. Jinniushan sits at the center of that debate because she's both archaic and advanced, both powerful and comparatively gracile, both regionally specific and broadly Eurasian. She cannot be reduced to a transitional label. She is evidence that human evolution in Asia was not a blank interval waiting for later arrivals. It was already rich, structured, and strange. This is the hidden importance of her massive frame. It pulls the discussion away from abstract ancestry charts and into ecology. Whatever label we place on her, she had to live through real winters, real hunger, real injury, real predators, and real childbirth risk. Her pelvis matters because it links body size, sex, birth mechanics, and brain size. A large-brained infant and a broad maternal pelvis are part of the same evolutionary tension that runs through human history. If Jinniushan females had modern-like aspects of pelvic form, then their reproductive biology already belonged to a complex human pattern, even while the rest of the skeleton retained archaic strength. Again, the fossil refuses a simple category. She's not primitive in the way older narratives imply. She's a heavy-bodied, large-brained, cold-adapted woman from a lineage already deeply invested in the same biological problems that shaped later humans. The northern and Altai connection also reframes the Denisovan image. Denisovans are often treated like ghosts because for years they were known mostly from DNA extracted from tiny fragments in Siberia. That created a strange imbalance. We had their genes before we had their bodies. They suggest that Denisovan-related populations, or at least Eastern archaic humans near that evolutionary neighborhood, were not slight. They were powerful. They occupied demanding environments. They carried big jaws, big skulls, big bodies, and unusual resilience. If Neanderthals were the famous cold-adapted humans of Europe, then these Eastern groups could have been something equally impressive across Asia, not lesser known because they were less important, but lesser known because the fossil record is harsher, DNA preservation is poorer, and many key sites lie in regions with complex geological histories. Jinniushan woman, then, becomes a test of imagination. Can we look at an ancient woman from China and picture strength rather than fragility? Can we admit that Eastern Eurasia had its own powerful archaic lineages without forcing them into outdated categories? Can we discuss the possibility of unusual pigmentation without turning speculation into certainty? Can we recognize that a young female body weighing nearly 175 pounds at 5 feet 5 inches is telling us something profound about climate, movement, diet, and survival? She was not a footnote. She was a biological statement. Her skeleton says that northern humans had already become formidable by 260,000 years ago, not merely clever, not merely upright, formidable. And that is why Jinniushan woman feels almost like a warning from the fossil record. The human past was not a ladder, and it was not a single migration story with all the interesting chapters saved for the end. It was a continent-wide, climate-driven, physically brutal experiment filled with populations that flourished, merged, vanished, and left behind fragments too powerful to ignore. In Liaoning, inside a collapsed cave, one of those fragments became a woman again. Broad, heavy, young, large-brained, and built for a northern world that would have killed the weak quickly. Whether her eyes were dark or startlingly light, whether her hair was black, brown, reddish, or fair, the essential truth is already carved into bone. She was not delicate. She was not marginal. She was one of the great archaic women of Eurasia, a tank-like survivor from a world where the body itself had to be a fortress, and where the line between Neanderthal, Denisovan, dragon man, and human was far more tangled than the old stories ever admitted. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe if you found this information compelling.